Hello and welcome to On Air with Ash. Today in this episode, we are joined by two very accomplished guests, Joanna Bryson and Vibhav Mithal. Joanna Bryson is a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School in Berlin, Germany. She has advised governments, corporations, and other agencies on AI policy globally. She has also served as an expert on the global partnership on AI and has been recognized widely for her pioneering work on AI ethics and AI governance. Vibhav Mithal is an AI and IPR lawyer and an associate partner at Anand and Anand. He was part of India's first AI and personality rights case like the Anil Kapoor case and part of the team that secured India's first software patent. He has been named a rising star by managing IP consecutively for 3 years. He has also co-authored with NASSCOM the Developers Playbook for Responsible AI in India as part of India AI mission. To shape the AI ecosystem, he is also affiliated with Center of Responsible AI at IIT Madras for Humanity and RIMAS Singapore. As an AI expert, he has represented India at the Quad Critical Emerging Technology Forum in Japan alongside experts from US, Japan and Australia. In today's episode, we explore the high-stakes race between AI regulation and AI advancement, a modern tale of the tortoise and the rabbit. China demonstrates unexpected capabilities in AI development, and the US faces a pivotal moment with the removal of privacy watchdog members. We explore what this means for global AI governance. We explore AI bias through a real-world example and reveal why the US might end up hurting itself more than the EU in this evolving AI landscape. Come join us. If we compare the race between AI regulation and the AI advancements, we can say that AI regulation can be considered tortoise and AI advancements can be considered the rabbit. So how can we ensure that our tortoise or the AI regulation is as fast as the AI advancement, or should we just hope that the rabbit falls asleep or the AI scaling laws seem less promising in the middle?
When I look at bias, first of all, I think fundamentally AI systems can never have zero bias. It's a conversation about bias mitigation.
The EU-US data privacy framework on which thousands of companies have relied to move the personal data across the Atlantic.
I wonder how China has gotten as good as it's gotten because it's been investing vast resources into building infrastructure and maintaining law. They've done really interesting things. I think it's just going to harm, I think, the US more than the EU, honestly, because the EU can still trade with the rest of the world. And if the US proves itself to be an unreliable partner, who is it going to trade with?
Transfer of personal data outside is permitted unless and until.
Hello and welcome to On Air with Aashka, Professor Bryson and Vibhav Mithal. Thank you for being privileged guests on this episode. Let's dive right into the questions. If we compare the race between AI regulation and the AI advancements or development, we can say that AI regulation can be considered tortoise and AI advancements can be considered the rabbit. So how can we ensure that our tortoise or the AI regulation is as fast as the AI advancement, or if not faster, and or should we just hope that the rabbit falls asleep or the AI scaling laws seem less promising in the middle? So what's your take on that?
Happy to leap in on that. Thanks for having us. I love that you're making reference, of course, to the Aesop's fable because, as we all know, the tortoise wins. It is literally the job of government to try to provide a stable, predictable environment. And so that includes not changing the law too fast. So, I mean, I was horrified when I found out how slowly the EU was doing its laws, and I was very worried about basically everything falling over. I sort of thought when I first came to the Hertie School, I'm at the Hertie School of Governance now, I sort of felt like we had about 5 years to get the digital governance in the EU in place before we really got hit by climate crisis. Of course, now we have a new crisis from my own home country, the United States, but which is probably just an extension of the crisis from Russia. But I think my thinking about this entire process has changed a lot just in the last even 48 hours. As we keep finding out new things. We've just seen China do what I always thought should have been possible. I never believed that the United States needed the scale of resources that they were burning to make the large language models. And now we're seeing evidence that this is true, that it can be done with very good guardrails, as the Chinese would demand, and at a lower level of energy consumption, although, of course, that may not scale. So I think I've talked long enough, and then I will release to
Thank you. No, see, I look at this and I also agree with Professor Bryson there about the analogy that you've drawn. I don't think that the tortoise has to be faster than the rabbit. I sort of look at this from a lens where I feel the rabbit shows advancement of the technology in a particular direction, and it's sort of leapfrogging in its own way and on a different path. The way I see it is the goal of the tortoise or the regulation is really, while the rabbit is running ahead, to be able to identify key concepts that the themes that are present in the technological advancement, and to once you've identified those themes, which can be easily, which we understand, transparency, explainability, human oversight, risk management principles, maybe sandboxes. Once we've identified those themes, I think the identification of themes is important, and then drafting the obligations around it would be important. So the identification of themes is one part, then and the obligations around it. Second aspect, while the rabbit race chases ahead, is who are the players or who are the other animals it meets on the way. So it's really about which players are there involved. Is it developers, deployers, and users? And along with that, the third final point that I have in this analogy would be that there would be jurisdictional differences. Like if the journey between the tortoise and the rabbit is in Europe, would be different from how it is in India, could be different from how it is in America. And while some animals would be common, some would be different. For example, if we talk about Digital Personal Data Protection Act, the data protection in India, we have a concept known as consent manager, which is not present anywhere in the EU, which is an individual who would collect consent directly from a data principal. So it's an intermediary between a data fiduciary or data controller and the data principal or the data subject, an intermediary known as consent manager. So that's my take on this space between a tortoise and a rabbit aspect.
Yeah, I think that also shows where the metaphor breaks down. So the fact is that there's a lot of tortoises. And if there were only one tortoise, because there's also a lot of rabbits, if there's only one tortoise, the rabbits would tie it up in a big net and it wouldn't get anywhere. And so it's, I totally agree. It's not that, every little state can't, and I don't mean by small country, I mean like every state within Germany or every state within the US can't have its own laws. They can't expect companies to comply with arbitrary rules. But we can expect compliance to the extent that we offer a market an economic payoff. Then the companies will come in making cost benefit decisions about where they're willing to do work. And so I think it makes all of us safer if different companies decide to go into different regions, if we have multiple possible providers, and also if we have multiple different ways of regulating, so that we don't have to worry about a single country being very much captured. And I say this again, I don't know exactly when you're releasing your podcast, but as we all saw the spectacle of tech billionaires being put in front of the cabinet by Donald Trump.
Yes, I completely agree with what both of you said, and Vibhav took the analogy to a different level with involving all other animals as well. So thank you so much for that response. So Vibhav, you mentioned about fairness, bias, and those buzzwords that companies or regulation have been using. So I recently used an AI tool to translate one of my episode clips to Hindi, and the clip, our distinguished female guest was speaking about responsible AI and was talking about being at a summit panel, and the AI tool did perfect job with translating every English word into Hindi. But the AI tool also transformed her gender from female to male, possibly thinking that a person talking about responsible AI sitting at a panel could only be a male. So my question to you is, like, are these AI tools reflection of the societal biases, or is society internalizing these biases into the real world? So what do you guys think about that?
Can I come in on this?
Sure.
I literally got the paper into Science on this in 2017. It was
okay.
So that's one of my areas. That I wouldn't say it was that the tool is thinking. In this case, it's expecting. So these tools work entirely about predicting that you're going to say something similar to what other people said on the internet. Okay, which is usually what they're trained off of. If you can find less biased text to train your tool on, then you will get less biased AI, because it's not that the AI is a prejudiced person. It's that the whole point of these generative AI systems, which turn out to be the best translators, is that they just guess. They guess from what they've seen before. So absolutely, the biases that are there reflect the biases in our society. In fact, the paper we had in 2017, I had expected that implicit biases would be present in the AI that's created this way. And I was right. We checked every single bias that there'd been a publication about that was like a generic bias, so we didn't have to go find specific people, and we could just look at internet scraped AI. But what I hadn't anticipated, one of my colleagues, in fact, Arvind Narayanan, decided to check it against the real world. And it turned out we actually made a breakthrough in human cognitive science, because we showed that the implicit biases are reflecting the lived experience. So it turns out that most people that sit on AI panels are male. And so that's why there's that expectation. And so we all have that internalized, which we can see with these implicit bias tests. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have conscious and explicit capabilities to try to improve our world. So that's why we have multiple ways of representing things as a human. Most AI systems don't have both of those, but nowadays we are building them. We call them guardrails, and we try to sort of force the AI into the part of the space that's the least objectionable, but it's always a little bit fraught. You can never be guaranteed that it's not exactly a person that's reasoning.
Got it. Yeah, Vibhav?
No, that's fascinating. So I'm going to take short portions of what Professor Bryson said, but again, I'm going to add a little bit of context before this. When I look at bias, first of all, I think fundamentally AI systems can never have zero bias. It's a conversation about bias mitigation. That's one.
Yeah.
Two, obviously for an AI system to be accurate, it has to achieve a particular intended result. So that's a bias, in one sense of bias towards a particular outcome. So when I'm talking about bias as an issue, I'm talking about something that it is performing. It was intended to do X, it's doing Y, it's doing Z, it's doing ABC. So it's away from its intended purpose. That's we have to look at bias. Then in that context, of course, what Professor Bryson is saying, the implicit bias aspect is important, because if we flesh that out a little bit, it could obviously be in the data. So that's one of the common aspects about bias is data. And then we talk about whether you have actual data. If you use actual data, does that lead to embedding bias in the system? For example, if I'm building a law enforcement tool, and then I use a particular level of data available with certain law enforcement agencies. Now, if that data in itself has certain implicit bias at the time of reporting of certain types of crime, then I've sort of used the tool to embed it with particular bias. That's one aspect which is very, very well talked about historical data and embedding bias with data aspects. Second aspect is, of course, another way of looking at bias is teams, right? So who is not in the room or who is in the room, and how are their decisions sort of impacting the way the tool is being built. And that, in my mind, along with sort of acting out as bias, also reflects, in one sense, I talk about ethical choices that are being made while you're when you're developing the tool, and the choices you're making while going along and training the algorithm. So yes, the bias is, of course, very much there in terms of various sources, and then the various sources in which bias could creep in. We're not getting into that. And finally, if we have to give it a law touch, then of course, guardrails, bias mitigation is predominantly a technological solution. Sometimes bias mitigation can be technological in nature, which depends on how you're looking to train the tool and what data you've used, or how are you mitigating the bias data. And then, of course, law has it has a role, but it would be more in the context of, say, constitutional right provisions or different aspects. So that's the broad landscape about bias. Your question was not about mitigation in that sense, but trying to just sort of connect it with our different perspectives in the room.
Yes.
I'm surprised that you say that the Constitution and the law are separate. I think the Constitution is a form of law.
No, of course. I meant Constitution. I meant Constitution is very much part of the law to address bias, but Constitution, like from the Indian lens, we're talking about only Constitution will attract only entities that are part of the central government or the state government or state actors. So from that legal lens, bias is being addressed through the constitutional provisions, and Constitution applies to only so many actors. Of course, rights are guaranteed across, But when you're talking about enforcement, then we're going after particular state actors. When you're talking about bias in the private space, right, for entities that may not be covered, say, by the Constitution or may not be held up for upholding constitutional rights, for example, the private sector, which is non-state actors in the Indian context, then we will have a situation where you have to look at bias from a voluntary framework perspective, bias mitigation and development perspective, and that was the direction of that aspect. We don't have a AI bias law, and the bias would only be one of the concepts that would be addressed when we look at addressing it.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to go back on was this thing about the policing and what data they had. So technically, we used to spend a lot of time trying to teach people this, and now we've kind of given up. But technically, in machine learning, bias is just any regularity. It doesn't have to be bad. So there's something called the gravity bias, which is that if you drop something, if you let go of something, you expect it to fall. Some things go up like helium balloons or something, but the vast majority of things go down. And that was why I was saying it was very exciting to find out that the implicit biases actually reflect lived reality. So the exact extent to which the AI bias thought, like, for example, nursing is a female job and programming is a male job, turned out to be perfectly correlated to the extent to which that in the United States, those jobs were held by women and men. So when you look at these policing things, I actually loved one of the things the Obama administration said at some point, that we don't want our AI from now till forever to be based on the outcomes of 200 years of bad policy. So what he meant was that, yes, there's some communities that have a high probability of an arrest happening, and that's true. It's not, it's not badly written data or inaccurate data, but you still have to say, what is the cause of that situation? And is it a regularity that you're willing to train your system on? So people that think that AI just magically comes from data, if only we have enough data, well, you've been sold that story by people who want to surveil you. Actually, AI is designed. And so you choose which kinds of data and which kinds of system. You don't have to use machine learning to use AI.
Got it. Yeah, that's a really great response. Let me just come to the next question. So, the Trump administration wants to remove 3 Democratic members out of the PCLOB board, that is Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. PCLOB is a bipartisan board designed to be a watchdog that has played an important role in the EU-US Privacy Shield framework and the EU-US data privacy framework, which has on which thousands of companies have relied to move the personal data across the Atlantic in compliance with the data protection laws. So now with 3 members fired or removed, because data or the personal data is the oil in this AI age, what could be the repercussions of this?
I'm really interested that you managed to pull up this particular aspect of all the many things that Trump has canceled, including AI, whatever they called it, that there was some kind of non-binding, non-law that everybody was excited about in the U.S. because they're trying to show they were doing as well as the EU when they weren't. It was just a policy. It was a voluntary policy. But anyway, now that's gone. Even that is gone. This is just one of many things. I mean, he's threatening he's starting to take over Greenland, like attack a NATO member. But I do think it is problematic. But basically, he's trying to deconstruct the law. And if you wonder how China has gotten as good as it's gotten, it's because it's been investing vast resources into building infrastructure and maintaining law. They've done really interesting things to make sure that you still have innovation, you still have new entries coming into markets that are dominated by very large players. The U.S. hasn't even been trying to do that. The EU has been trying not to have really large players. And then sometimes they say, oh, why are there no large players? It's like, because we're well regulated. But we still have a huge digital economies, absolutely on par with the rest of the world, with the exception of the U.S., where they may be overvalued. So judging speaking on in terms of market cap. So anyway, I'm afraid I should shut up because maybe Vibhav knows more about that specific piece. But I know that there's all kinds of infrastructure between the U.S. and EU being torn down. Possibly war has been declared. We know that the U.S. has said that it's going to expand, and expansion is already like a form of war. So somebody has to lose as somebody's winning when it comes to expansion, not in general. I'm a big believer in public goods, not about physical space on the earth. Right. So I think this is one of many ways that is just going to harm I think the U.S. more than the EU, honestly, because the EU can still trade with the rest of the world, and if the U.S. proves itself to be an unreliable partner, who is it going to trade with? So.
Yeah. So, do you think there's an international body that can play a role over here? Like, because this bipartisan effort is no longer available, like any international body like United Nations or OECD can jump in to kind of make it better, or what do you think?
You want to go take a shot at that? I can
I guess
chime in.
I mean I don't know that I don't think so. There's a bunch of people. Again, this is what we were talking about before about global governance, right? If we use a UN body or something, then and there's lots of people who would love to be the one who sets up that UN body or IEEE, one of these standards or organizations or something. There's like, and I'm sure between the US and EU, then we could the Commission could set something up or whatever. But I don't. Again, I worry. I do think we need to have globally set up treaties so that should happen within the context of the EU or UNESCO. But I think it's really, really important that enforcement is done by states so that we maintain diversity, so that we maintain that what a state is it's the thing that has executive force. So I think I don't think we want to have a single global anything, because whenever we do, except the UN itself,
Yeah.
Even there, we have multiple other regional things like the OSCE, the India is in the Shanghai Organization Cooperation, BRICS, the EU, the NAFTA. So it's important that we have options, that we always have options, and that because if something falls, then something else can be used to start rebuilding.
Got it. Yeah.
So I'll take the last one first, actually. So building on that, right? So I agree with the fact that one common international framework sort of assumes in it that there'll be uniformity on all aspects. When we talk about an international framework, I think we have to look at aspects where commonality can be achieved, and for that, I think we already have, in my view, we have a fair number of principles which sort of sound out and is similar. We start from the OECD principles on privacy, security, transparency, those principles, core principles, and some of which have now been sort of legally articulated in, say, EU AI Act or any laws that may be modeled on that, right? So we have a certain level of understanding of the core principles around AI which we want to adhere to, right? So that's one aspect. So that takes away, in my mind at least, a certain level of international consensus that is needed, because we already have a fair amount of consensus on those principles. Now, if we are to go one more layer of detail to that, then we need international collaboration will only mean if we are arriving at some common, agreeing on some common obligations across nations, right? That's the most. So we can agree most on principles, we can agree most on common obligations. Say, for example, if we're agreeing that explainability is required, then everyone's agreeing upon what really is the legal obligation to achieve explainability. Or if risk management and assessing risk in each life cycle across the AI life cycle is important, then what are those steps that we need to do? So that's the level of national framework that we have. But apart from those sort of broad principles and perhaps some level of common agreement of common obligations, AI would then become quite regional and jurisdiction specific, in my mind, at least more so. For the international cooperation part, like I was saying, we have to have high agreement. We'll have to have agreement either at the principles, that's the highest level, which we've already, like I was mentioning earlier, we've achieved a certain level of agreement on those principles. Second layer of detail could be the common obligations or obligations that are required to adhere to those principles, right? Those principles could be articulated in different concepts. For example, we have privacy. Privacy becomes a concept such as data protection. Data protection has certain obligations under the law. So we have a certain level of homogeneous or agreeable obligations that goes across the board. That is the level of international cooperation, in my mind, that we think is possible in the AI space. Otherwise, because of the space being gives countries competitive advantage. There are models of the hardware aspect has, for example, the US, amongst various things, has this new rule about chips, about 20 countries that can import any kind of chips. Certain countries are that are not allowed chips, and then some that have to apply for license. So because of the nature of AI and the nature of competitiveness sought in AI, it would be difficult for everyone to agree on the same thing because we don't have common interests on the table. But to the extent that we can have alignment, yes, international alignment would be helpful, but I don't see it happening at the kind of everyone agreeing to the same thing. With some broad level alignment and maybe some alignment on principles. Sorry, broad level alignment on principles, and then a lower level of perhaps obligations.
Got it. Yeah, I agree with what you said. With the DPDPA Act that India has, the Digital
Personal Data Protection Act, yes.
Digital Personal Data Protection Act. So, do we have any kind of watchdogs that oversees the movement of Indian personal data overseas? Do you think that is required, or is it already there?
So this is an important point. I think data localization was one of the most controversial topics in the previously withdrawn bill, right? Primary reason being that you're not looking to interfere with the free flow of business unless and until absolutely necessary, right? So what Indian law is there now is that everything is permitted. Transfer of personal data outside is permitted, unless and until the government notifies any country to whom personal data cannot be transferred. So the default rule right now is that everything is okay till it is restricted. Right?
Okay.
And
ban is put or anything like that?
No. I mean, of course, there will be certain restrictions. I'm not saying there will not be any restrictions, but the point is those restrictions will only come out after the central government introduces the notification about how to restrict it and which countries are restricted. Which is why I'm saying the default rule is everything is allowed to be transferred outside India, except for those where the government decides that, okay, we want to restrict this.
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because it is the new oil. So let's dive into the next question. Recently I came across this paper, and this is very much related to the work that you are doing, called AI Copyright Trap. And I found this very interesting statement. If the problem is not that AI models are being trained on copyright works without their owner's consent, then requiring copyright owners' consent or compensation for the use of their work in AI training datasets is not the appropriate solution. And if the only real copyright problem is that the outputs of generative AI may be substantially similar to specific human authored and copyright protected works, then copyright law, as we know, it already provides the solution. And I remember while signing off 2024, you had written a LinkedIn post outlining something similar. So what are your thoughts on this AI copyright trap? And also, will this trap be as relevant in the agentic AI age that we are entering into as it was in the generative AI age? What's coming up next? The AI copyright trap, what's the AI regulation scene in India, and a lot more. So subscribe to On Air with Aashka and hit that bell icon to catch the part 2 of this episode when it airs. Share your thoughts in the comment section below and help us spread the word, because every AI regulation decision made today will shape our tomorrow. This is Aashka signing off for now, but like AI regulation itself, this conversation is far from being over. Let's ride these airwaves again soon.